Have you ever heard of the little village of Quinton in Warwickshire? Probably not. The small village is located in the middle of England, somewhere between Oxford and Birmingham. There are not even 30 streets there, and even today, less than 2,000 people live in Quinton. In 1945, the population was significantly lower, of course. This makes it all the more remarkable that shortly before the end of World War II, something happened in Quinton that remains unexplained to this day. If you had to describe Charles Walton in one word, it would probably be recluse. You might think that in a small place like Quinton, everyone knows everyone else and you would inevitably bump into your neighbors all the time. But Charles Walton keeps to himself. The farm worker lives in Lower Quinton, one of the 3 parts of the village, in a small cottage at number 15. Charles is a widower, and since the death of his wife, has lived alone with his niece Edith Walton. Charles adopted her in 1915 after the girl's mother died. 30 years later, Edith is now 33 and still lives with Charles. She helps him with the housework and on the property. In return, she can live with him and receives £1 a week. Charles himself has reached the ripe old age of 74. Although he needs a walking stick because he has rheumatism, stopping work is not an option. Somehow, they have to make ends meet. Charles' weekly pension is very small, and although Charles is rather introverted, he is by no means unpopular in Quinton. When Charles asks farmer Alfred Potter for a job, he agrees immediately. From the summer of 1944, Charles is able to work on Alfred's farm, which is called the first in the village. Edith also takes on odd jobs outside the home from time to time. In February 1945, she works for the Royal Society of Arts. As the name suggests, the society promotes and catalogues works of art, among other things. The RSA is actually based in London, but during World War II, it moved its headquarters to Quinton. In the small village, the likelihood of heavy military strikes and damage to the building is low. Edith is also working for the RSA on February 14, 1945, before finishing work in the early evening. She returns home around 6 p.m. Charles usually returns from work on the farm a good 2 hours before her, but on this day, it is different. The house is empty. Edith is worried and asks her neighbor Harry Beasley for advice. He doesn't know what to do either, so they go together to First Farm to ask Charles's boss, Alfred. He hasn't spoken to Charles that day, but he saw him in a field from a distance. The 3 of them, Charles's niece Edith, neighbor Harry, and his boss Alfred, set off for the field. What they find there is still the subject of numerous myths and conspiracy theories to this day. It is immediately clear that Charles has been murdered, but that's not all. Some suspect that there is a dark secret behind his murder. On February 14th, Charles was supposed to tend to some hedges at Hillground. At that time, Hillground was basically nothing more than a large field on the edge of a small hill called Meon Hill. His boss, Alfred Potter, did not see Charles at all that day. Charles went straight from his cottage to Meon Hill in the morning. 2 witnesses from the village confirmed that they saw Charles alone on his way to work that morning. He was carrying a pitchfork and a kind of hand scythe as tools. These 2 items are still with Charles when his body is found. Or rather, in him. The scythe is stuck in Charles' neck. His body was impaled with the pitchfork and pinned to the field at Meon Hill. A large cross is said to have been carved into his chest. When Edith sees Charles like this, she collapses. The injuries are so severe that Charles's head is almost severed from the rest of his body. Charles also has numerous injuries all over his body. In addition to the pitchfork and the scythe, the murder weapon was probably his own walking stick. This is found a few meters away in some bushes. Charles' blood and hair are stuck to it. Harry takes Edith home and alerts the police in the village on the way. Alfred stays at the scene to wait for the police. Quinton is not exactly London or Manchester, of course, so it takes a while for the police to show up. At first, only a single police officer arrives. At around 7:05 p.m., investigator Michael arrives at the scene. Reinforcements from the nearest large town are expected to arrive later. It's clear to everyone that a village policeman will be overwhelmed by such a brutal murder. Alfred is the first to give his impressions directly at the scene. However, he can't provide much information. He had appointments in the morning. Around noon, however, he saw Charles working from a distance. He was trimming the hedges along the fields as usual, just as Alfred had instructed him to do. Alfred is therefore probably the last person to have seen Charles alive. Charles was found dead in the early evening, just a few meters away. Charles's pocket watch, which he always carried with him, is missing. Charles left his wallet at home on the day he was murdered. Apart from the pocket watch, he has no other valuables with him. But can the theft of a simple pocket watch explain such a brutal murder? The injuries are so severe that a personal motive seems more likely. But Charles was a self-confessed loner, and someone who never has contact with others can't really harbor such extreme hatred. The police's first theory is that the perpetrator could be from a prisoner of war camp. In 1945, there is a prison camp called Long Maston near Newbold-on-Store, where men from several countries are being held. On February 15th, the local police make an initial inquiry to Scotland Yard and inform them about the case. The message speculates that the perpetrator could be a madman or an Italian prisoner. No further explanation is given as to why an Italian prisoner should be explicitly responsible. However, it should be noted that during World War II, there was a very hostile atmosphere toward Italians in England. Italy declared war on Great Britain in 1940. As a result, the reputation of Italians in English society suffered greatly. So perhaps this unexplained suspicion simply arose from that. Inmates of these prison camps were often sent to work on surrounding farms. This gave them a certain amount of freedom, so to speak, despite their imprisonment. And theoretically, it would therefore be possible that one of the prisoners murdered Charles. This idea is probably much more bearable for the villagers than the thought that a murderer is living among them. Police officer Robert Fabian is sent to Quinton from Scotland Yard as the lead investigator. However, the investigation proves rather difficult. Fabian later states that he and his family received several anonymous threats during their time in Quinton. The villagers were cold and secretive. An Italian interpreter is also called in to help investigate the lead to the prison camp. However, this leads nowhere. Apart from the geographical proximity of the camp, there is not a single clue to suggest that one of the inmates could have murdered Charles. With no other leads, investigators are focusing on what people in Quinton are saying about Charles. Rumors have been circulating about Charles for some time. I've already told you that he was a rather reclusive guy. Although the villagers generally liked him, some people found him strange. This was mainly because Charles seemed to have an exceptional rapport with animals. Even the wildest dogs are said to have been calmed by his voice and stopped barking. Birds would eat out of his hand, and Charles kept toads as pets. In a sleepy English village in the mid-20th century, that was reason enough for some residents to suspect Charles of witchcraft. And the whole thing picks up speed when a strange book turns up during the investigation. One of the investigators comes across a book entitled Folklore, Old Customs and Superstitions in Shakespeare Land. It was published in 1929 by the clergyman J. Harvey Bloom. The Shakespeare reference in the title refers to the fact that William Shakespeare came from Warwickshire, where the Charles Walton case also took place. In this book, which one of the police officers found, there is a chapter that raises questions. It says that a boy named Charles Walton attracted attention in Warwickshire in 1885. For 9 days in a row, the ghost of a black dog appeared to him on his way home. And if you've seen or read the third Harry Potter book, you'll know that black dogs are considered an omen of death in British folklore. On the last night, the ghost of a headless woman is said to have appeared to him alongside the ghost of the dog. When he arrived home, he found the body of his sister. The whole thing is said to have taken place exactly 60 years before our Charles Walton died in Warwickshire. And many speculate that the Charles Walton of that time is the same Charles Walton who was murdered 60 years later. He is said to have had an extraordinary connection with animals. So that fits, and the age also matches. The text from the book states that the villagers became afraid of Charles after this incident. And old Charles Walton did indeed live a very secluded life. The theory quickly arose that some villagers may have suspected Charles of practicing black magic. That is why his sister died at that time, and he turned away from everyone afterwards. Unfortunately, it cannot be verified from the records of that time whether he really had another sister who died in 1885. Accordingly, it has never been possible to determine whether this is really the same Charles Walton. The age and location match, but everything else is pure speculation. Strange things have been happening for decades at Meon Hill, where Charles's body was found. According to an 18th century legend, the devil himself once wreaked havoc at Meon Hill. The residents of Quinton say that the devil threw a boulder from the hill onto the village to destroy the newly built Evesham Abbey Road. However, the villagers were able to prevent this by praying. The boulder fell onto Cleve Hill in Cheltenham, a few kilometers away, instead of Evesham Abbey. According to another version of the story, the devil threw a lump of earth at the village to destroy a road. However, he missed his target, and that is how Meon Hill came into being. From the lump of earth that the devil dropped. According to this version, the hill is literally a creation of the devil. No wonder, then, that the fact that Charles's body was found there of all places caused additional panic among the residents of Quinton. And because the investigators have no other leads, clues such as those found in the book are also being investigated. Chief Investigator Robert Fabian himself once described Charles's murder as a witch murder. He also claims to have encountered black dogs on Meon Hill several times during his investigation. This is an indirect reference to the story in the book. One clue that is not supernatural, however, could be the murder of a woman named Anne Tennant. Although this took place in 1875, 70 years before Charles's murder, 80-year-old Anne Tennant was also killed with a pitchfork. This happened in Long Combe, about 24 kilometers from Lower Quinton. However, the perpetrator was observed committing the murder and was immediately arrested. He is said to have claimed that Anne Tennant was a witch and that he had killed her for that reason. He died 15 years later in an institution where he had been committed after a trial. In 1954, the British newspaper Daily Mirror published an article on the murder of Charles Walton, claiming that there were parallels to the murder of Anne Tennant. A journalist wrote more precisely at the time, "The police have found another connection between the murders, but I have undertaken not to reveal it." However, it must also be said that the Daily Mirror was already a tabloid newspaper at the time. Accordingly, I would treat this claim by the journalist with caution, especially since the murders took place 70 years apart and Anne Tennant's murderer had already been dead for more than 50 years before Charles was killed. Some sources claim that Anne was Charles's grandmother or great-grandmother. However, we have not been able to verify this information. If it were true, it would be interesting. Like so much else in the Charles Walton case, a connection to Anne Tennant is more myth than real clue. No wonder, then, that the case became a cold case. In 1960, 15 years later, Charles' pocket watch was finally found. Although the police claimed to have searched his house thoroughly at the time, The pocket watch turned up during renovation work on Charles' cottage in the toilet block. It is unclear why it remained undiscovered for so long. Some suspect that the murderer may have placed the watch there 15 years later, perhaps as a symbolic act of atonement. However, it is also possible that the watch was simply overlooked at the time. Officially, the Charles Walton case remains unsolved to this day. Over the years, Robert Fabian has named only one suspect: Alfred Potter, Charles' boss. At first, Alfred said he had seen Charles at work at noon from a distance. Later, however, he slightly changed his statement. Now he only says that he saw someone. In addition, Alfred said in one of his first statements that he had actually wanted to go to Charles on the 14th to help him with the hedge. However, he decided not to go because he had an emergency with a cow that was stuck in a ditch. Instead, he waited until noon to take care of it. But the cow had already gotten stuck in the ditch on February 13th, the day before, and died. The carcass was removed on February 14th, but not at noon, but in the afternoon. In a statement a week later, Alfred makes no mention of this cow. He says he went home at noon and read the newspaper. So there are definitely some contradictions. After this new statement, Alfred also emphasized that he had touched both Charles's scythe and pitchfork. He was the first person at the scene, so that wouldn't be so far-fetched. However, Alfred is said to have explained to the police with great vehemence that his fingerprints were on the murder weapons and why. He is also said to have stated that he had already explained this to the village police officer Michael on February 14th. However, this was not true. In the end, no fingerprints from Alfred were found on the murder weapons. So either he was worrying for nothing, or he may have cleaned the murder weapons, at least provisionally, before the police arrived. In any case, he was alone with the body for a while after Edith and Henry went to the police. However, he also had no motive. A few witnesses stated that Charles owed Alfred money because they had lent him money. However, Charles still had a financial cushion thanks to the inheritance from his wife and sister. If the financial pressure had really been that great, he could have paid off his debts. According to some reports, however, Charles was still facing bankruptcy shortly before his death. However, no one knows what he could have done with all his money. He and Edith lived very modestly. What is certain, however, is that no witness reported ever seeing Alfred and Charles arguing. Alfred never said a bad word about Charles and was not known to be violent or abusive. He was therefore never charged or convicted. The murder of Charles Walton remains unsolved to this day and is therefore fertile ground for a wide variety of theories. Even lead investigator Fabian believed until the end that the case was linked to supernatural forces or a ritual. In his biography, he wrote the following: "One of my most memorable murder cases took place in the village of Lower Quinton, near the stone druid circle of the Whispering Knights. There, a man had been killed during a reenactment of a druidic ceremony on Valentine's Day. He is clearly referring to the murder of Charles Walton. However, the Whispering Knights he writes about are not a circle of druids, but the remains of a Neolithic burial chamber. This burial chamber had nothing to do with druids, i.e. Celtic priests. Basically, Fabian's notes only show that he himself definitely believed in ritual murder. And perhaps that is ultimately what prevented Charles Walton's real murderer from ever being found. There are many theories and further details about the case on the internet. In this video, we have only included information from selected sources. There are many more claims about Charles's alleged witchcraft and rituals. Unfortunately, most of them come from blogs or forums where information is difficult or impossible to verify. But so the myth of Charles Walton and the alleged ritual murder lives on. Now it's your turn. What do you think happened to Charles Walton? It cannot even be ruled out that supernatural forces were at work. Theoretically, it would be enough if someone was certain enough that Charles was practicing witchcraft and therefore murdered him. However, hundreds of villagers were questioned without anyone being specifically suspected, with the exception of Alfred, due to his contradictory statement. On the other hand, he had no real motive. I'm curious to hear your opinions and look forward to your comments. Other than that, there's not much more to say. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching this video, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.